Many of you know that just a few weeks ago, I was facing very serious felony charges and 16 years in prison for rescuing some dogs from a massive beagle production facility called Ridglan Farms. Well, we've now turned the tables on Ridglan, and we're in the midst of potentially bringing criminal charges against Ridglan and saving 3,000 dogs and maybe ending all experiments on dogs. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about how that happened, because it's a wild story and has implications far beyond just vivisection, but for animal rights. Because one of the fundamental problems in animal rights is that very rarely is a law actually enforced to protect any animals, even when a law exists. And when it comes to dogs, especially, Americans do support protections for dogs. They want those protections legally to be enforced, and yet rarely do we ever see any enforcement. The mechanism we're bringing on July 10th in Dane County, Wisconsin, is one chance for us to bring a criminal case against Ridglan Farms, enforce the laws, one of the very rare instances where we will enforce the laws against a big corporations abusing animals, and set a precedent politically and legally for other activists and advocates for animals across the country, maybe even the world, to enforce these legal protections for animals and save billions of animals from abuse and exploitation. So I'm going to walk you through how this all unfolded. But I guess it starts with, what is Ridglan Farms and how do we even hear about it in the first place? So I've known about Ridglan for really the last couple decades. And I think one of the first things I heard about Ridglan was this report from an anti-vivisection organization in the early 2000s that said there were piles of burning animals and the smell was so bad, neighbors and employees were just horrified and disgusted just by the smell of apparently hundreds of dogs are being burned on site. Around that same time, as a result of that report, the USDA actually sent some inspectors to Ridglan and said, hey, we got to check this out. And this is super messed up, but they found that there were dangerous and unsanitary conditions at Ridglan, but decided not to do anything about it. So let me just say it again. You got piles of burning dogs, apparently, dangerous and unsanitary conditions, and absolutely nothing is done. But this is par for the course when it comes to vivisection and the mass breeding of animals for experiments. You don't have to take my word for that. You can take the government's word, because over the last few decades, partly because of situations like Ridglan's in the early 2000s, a lot of people have complained to the main federal body that enforces animal cruelty laws or enforces kind of animal protections and ensures animals are protected in labs and breeding facilities. And people have been upset that nothing seems to happen, just like Ridglan Farms. And so the USDA had an official within its own department called the Inspector General. The Inspector General is usually an attorney who has a big staff, often hundreds of people work underneath him or her or them. And their job is to ensure federal departments are following their own standards, right? Are doing their actual jobs, doing the things they're legally required to do. And very disturbingly, the Inspector General, beginning in 2005, started issuing internal reports within the USDA describing its enforcement mechanisms as, quote, basically meaningless. That they were going around just slapping these companies on the wrist for the most egregious animal abuses. And I'll describe some of these abuses in a bit. I apologize ahead of time and tell you that if you're trying to avoid listening to stories of animal cruelty, you're on the wrong video. But they find these horrific abuses of animals, including dogs, even dogs, and nothing was being done. That the vivisection companies are treating this as basically a cost of doing business. And there are two primary reasons for that. One is the revolving door, right? So many times the inspectors who are working at the USDA would get jobs at the industry and vice versa. And that goes all the way to the top of the USDA. So the current head of the USDA, even under Joe Biden, is a guy by the name of Tom Vilsack, who's formerly the president of the U.S. Dairy Export Council. In other words, he worked for a big agricultural industry, and then he's supposed to regulate these industries that are torturing and killing animals. It doesn't work. You can't have the fox guarding the henhouse. But the other reason was because of the massive lobbying efforts. These industries do an extraordinarily good job of lobbying the government and pressuring the government to ensure they're not being held accountable to the law. In fact, not only are they good at preventing fines or any other criminal or legal sanctions against them, they're very good at getting money from taxpayers. And at the same time that the USDA's own Inspector General was saying, hey, enforcement of animal cruelty laws is basically meaningless, the vivisection industry was getting, according to PETA, just from the NIH, just from one agency at the federal government, the National Institutes of Health, in 1 year, $19.6 billion. $19.6 billion with a B dollars because they're lobbying. And when you have a lobbying operation that's that good, it's also going to be very good at preventing your industry from facing any sort of legal accountability. So we know this is the general paradigm. How did I get involved in this case? Well, again, I heard about the burning animals. I heard about the USDA finding that they're dangerous and unsanitary conditions, but enforcement is basically meaningless. But I've got a buddy who used to live in Wisconsin named Jeremy Beckham, who, when we started doing investigations in 2014 and 15, he said, you got to check this place out that's torturing thousands of dogs. Because most Americans, love dogs. Most Americans, frankly, love all animals, but especially dogs. We don't want to see them hurt. Most Americans believe that animal cruelty laws are being enforced to protect dogs. When you hear about a case like Michael Vick, an NFL player, he was an NFL star, one of the most famous people in the country, one of the most popular people in the country. And when he killed a few dogs, the country turned on him and wanted him thrown in prison. And he went to federal prison for 2 years for killing just a handful of dogs. Yet these industries, according to Jeremy, are confining and torturing and killing tens of thousands of dogs. And Jeremy actually lived in Madison, had driven up to Ridglan and seen, the facility. They have the huge tree line that blocks the facility off from the public. You can smell a huge amount of feces. And as you get closer, you can actually hear thousands of dogs screaming and barking, just desperate to escape. But the entire place is sealed off. It's indoor industrial sheds. You can't see what's happening inside. And so what Jeremy did was he started accumulating research. He was getting scientific articles published from researchers experimenting on Ridglan dogs through FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, finding out what the federal government and the state governments in Wisconsin were finding inside Ridglan Farms when they did occasional inspections, which are frankly usually meaningless, as the Inspector General of the USDA itself found, but occasionally does find things that are interesting. And what Jeremy and other activists found when they started digging through these documents was a lot of just wild and crazy shit. So for example, when people started looking through the research studies being performed at Ridglan Farms, they found, among other things, experiments where dogs were force-fed laundry detergent to the point that they vomited blood for 2 to 4 hours and died. They were forcibly injected with rabies by a very large pharmaceutical company called Merck in 2018, not because we need more rabies treatments. In fact, we have a very effective rabies vaccine, but to make a rabies vaccine the company could then patent and try and deceive consumers who don't know any better to spend money on an expensive non-generic patent that could make the company potentially billions of dollars. And maybe for me, one of the worst experiments, just because it seemed so stupid and pointless, was force-feeding dogs through a process called oral gavage, which is essentially shoving a tube down a dog's throat multiple times a day often, and force-feeding them toxic chemicals, in this case, an artificial sweetener. And they force-fed all these dogs these artificial sweeteners to the point that their testicles are shriveling up. Then they drained them all of their blood and experimented and vivisected on them to see what happened. Also, we can make another artificial sweetener that we don't need. We have plenty of artificial sweeteners, and frankly, we don't need any artificial sweeteners in the first place. And so the first category of evidence that we saw that was disturbing me was these horrific experiments. Now, the problem with the experiments themselves is if you're trying to enforce animal cruelty laws, again, the vivisection industry has an incredible amount of power and has lobbied state and federal governments to exempt its practices from the animal cruelty laws. And Wisconsin is one of the states that does exempt teaching, research, and education involving animals from animal cruelty laws. So if you're Michael Vick and you're torturing an animal for dogfighting ring, and Michael Vick basically hung a bunch of dogs, he grabbed them, put them in a noose and hung them because they were not good fighters, then you're a criminal and a felon, you go to prison. But if you do exactly the same thing and you say, oh, it's done in the name of science, then in Wisconsin and many other states, it's completely fine, which makes no sense. But it's a huge obstacle legally you have to overcome. So the important thing is that when we started digging deeper into Ridglan, we found that the evidence of animal cruelty was not just about the stuff they were doing in terms of experiments, but also in their breeding and production facility. Let me explain. So Ridglan Farm has about 4,000 dogs any given point in time. About 1,000 of these dogs are being used for research. They're being injected with rabies, all sorts of wild stuff is being done to them. But unfortunately, it's all covered by the research exemption under the state and federal animal cruelty laws. But it also has separate buildings where it is producing beagles, breeding beagles for research. And breeding and producing beagles for research and for other purposes is not research itself. And so the messed up things they're doing to dogs in those separate facilities are things that can be addressed by the law. And that's what we needed to do. We needed to try and get evidence of this animal cruelty, not in the research arm of the facility, but in the breeding facilities. But it's hard to find that evidence. So what do we do? Well, we did what open rescue activists do all over the world. We walked right in and we tried to document what was happening inside with our own eyes and our own cameras. And when I walked into Ridglan Farms in April of 2017, we saw just horrific conditions. Thousands of dogs raised in cages, two rows of cages, one on top of the other. Catch pans where feces and ammonia were piling up on the cage floors, to the point that in some cases, the ammonia was so bad that even government inspectors who walked through this facility had said they had nausea and their throat and their nasal passage was irritated for hours after they left the facility, just from a quick inspection. Imagine what those dogs are living like when they're experiencing that every day. It made me most disturbingly, partly as a result of things we saw, we realized that dogs were being surgically mutilated, including a procedure called devocalization, where they cut the dog's vocal cords because they're just making too much noise. And through whistleblowers and former employees of the company, we learned that a lot of these surgical mutilations, including not just devocalization surgery, but another surgery called cherry eye surgery, where they just pin a dog down and cut an eye gland out of their eye that's infected, are being done oftentimes without any painkillers and without a veterinarian even present, just by an untrained staff member. This misconduct, unlike the stuff that's happened in the research facility, is not exempted under the animal cruelty laws. In the state of Wisconsin, mistreating an animal is a crime. In fact, the law states that no person may treat any animal in a cruel manner. And cruel is defined in a shockingly wide fashion. It's a broad definition of cruelty. Cruel just means causing unnecessary and excessive pain or suffering, or unjustifiable injury or death. Again, if you cause unnecessary and excessive pain, you are violating the law in the state of Wisconsin. And furthermore, if you violate the law and cause the animal to be mutilated or to die, even if you don't intend for the animal to be mutilated or dead, if you cause the animal mutilation or death, it is now a felony in the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin law also, again for non-research facilities, provides for a legal requirement that animals must be given proper shelter. And proper shelter is defined as including proper ventilation. You cannot force an animal to breathe feces and ammonia and urine every single day of their life, to the point that all the animals are experiencing nausea and have respiratory issues. And you have to give animals, quote, freedom of movement. And lack of freedom of movement can be proven under Wisconsin law, and this is set out by statute, by debility, stress, or abnormal behavior. Okay, so why am I saying this all to you? Because all the things that I saw in April 2017 when I walked in Ridglan Farms were a violation of these exact laws. We saw numerous animals with foot injuries who were spinning in cages psychotically, who were clearly experiencing unnecessary and excessive pain or suffering. We saw animals who didn't have proper ventilation, right? Who were standing on top of their own feces and urine, not just one catch pan of feces and urine, but hundreds of catch pans filled with feces and urine that wasn't properly being ventilated. And we saw hundreds of animals who were exhibiting abnormal behaviors, what's called stereotypic behaviors, because they were raised in a 2-foot by 4-foot metal cage their entire lives. So we had prosecutors, veterinary experts, and other professionals look at all this evidence that we found. We also dug deeper into federal and state inspection records and found corroborating evidence from federal and state inspectors who had not held these companies accountable, but had made notes and observations in their own inspections that these things were happening, that animals are experiencing foot injuries from the wire flooring, that are going psychotic from living in life in a cage. We brought all this to the attention of the authorities in May of 2018, and guess what happened? Even though the federal government had said enforcement is basically meaningless, even though every animal advocate, every animal expert, even nonpartisan groups had looked into this system, this paradigm, had concluded this is all complete sham, the animals aren't being protected at all. Even though all of that was very clear to the district attorney of the state of Wisconsin and the county of Dane in Madison, Wisconsin, when we brought all this very clear evidence that could have been used in a criminal prosecution and could have proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Ridglan had committed a crime, we brought this evidence to the Dane County District Attorney. They charged me with many felonies, and I faced 16 years in prison until a few weeks ago, when just days before the trial was to start, they suddenly dropped all the charges. And their stated explanation, both in a written filing and in court, was preposterous. It was preposterous. What they said was, We had to drop the charges because the animal rights activists are making death threats against Ridglan Farms. Okay, this is preposterous for a number of reasons. First of all, you can't make death threats against a company because a company is not a person, and a company cannot be killed, right? You cannot murder a company. There's literally no statute in the books for murder of a company because a murder is not a person. A company is not a living being, and you cannot murder a company. But secondly, even if Ridglan Farms were a person who could be murdered, just ask yourself if the stated explanation by the authorities makes any sense. They're saying we threatened to murder the victim of a crime, and that's why they have to drop all the charges against us? Like, if this is a pathway to getting charges dropped against you, then we need to be giving advice to criminals across the nation, because if you get charged with stealing from a grocery store, just threaten to kill everyone in the grocery store and they'll drop all the charges, right? That's not the way the law actually works. Generally, when you threaten to commit more crimes, they are more incentivized to punish you, not less incentivized. Well, what is actually going on is what I told you at the beginning of this entire conversation, which is the government is asleep at the wheel and in fact in bed with the industry. And when the government and the industry together realized that prosecuting us would bring more attention to the criminal conduct by the industry itself, they realized they wanted the case to go away. Okay. And as I said on the day those charges are dismissed, I was profoundly disappointed in that outcome because I wanted, the animal rights movement needed, the animals needed an opportunity to shine some light on these abuses. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, Wisconsin, along with many other states and even the federal government, have a special mechanism under the law for trying to address situations where the law is not being enforced because of a conflict of interest. And we talked about the revolving door, the fact that you have the fox guarding the hen house, the former president of the Dairy Export Council is supposedly protecting animals, including dairy animals, from the abuses of the dairy industry. We talked about the lobbying influence of the vivisection industry and the animal agriculture industry, and how not only are they not fined, they're basically slapped on the wrist. There's literally this mechanism that used to exist under the Animal Welfare Act, where when a vivisector violated the law, they wouldn't be violated or cited. They'd just be given what's called a teachable moment. It's like they were treating multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies like 3-year-old children. I wish every criminal got that chance. If you commit a crime, I doubt a police officer is going to say, it's a teachable moment. Just go on your way. You're going to get convicted. You're going to get charged. You're going to be told you can't do that again. But when you have this sort of situation where there's a profound conflict of interest between the prosecutors and the government and the individuals who are victimized by a crime, in this case, dogs, what you need to do is appoint a special prosecutor. And this is a proceeding that's been made famous over the last few decades because it's been used against many presidents, because the president is the chief law enforcement officer of the nation, right? And if the chief executive of the entire nation, the chief law enforcement officer of the nation, needs to be investigated, you can't have one of the normal prosecutors investigate them, because those normal prosecutors are the employees of the president. The president can fire them, right? In fact, that's what Nixon tried to do. He actually tried to fire a bunch of prosecutors for investigating. In one case, just a wild story, but actually true, he had the wife of one of his prosecutors kidnapped. He kidnapped the wife of one of his prosecutors to prevent him from investigating his crimes in Watergate. And we've seen similar shenanigans by more recent presidents like Donald Trump, which is why the federal government appointed a special prosecutor to investigate Trump, because the idea was we need to ensure this attorney is unbiased and doesn't have any conflict of interest. So a judge, or in some cases an attorney general, can just say, look, we have to recuse ourselves from this case because of conflicts of interest. We'll find some independent lawyer who doesn't work for the government right now to investigate these charges. And what can be done to presidents can also be done to vivisectors and factory farms. And that's what we're doing in Ridglan Farms. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the evidence we plan to present as part of the special prosecutor petition. But first, let me explain why this petition is so important. It's not just important because we can save 3,000 dogs, although that is very important. It'd be a tremendous victory for us to get every single one of those dogs who's being abused out of those cages. It's important because it sets an incredibly crucial precedent in other jurisdictions. Because if in Wisconsin, we can use the special prosecutor mechanism to get around the fox guarding the hen house, get around the government being asleep at the wheel, just actively corrupt in not enforcing the laws to protect animals, then we can do it in California. We can do it in Pennsylvania. We can do it in New York. We can do it across the country. We can do it at the federal level with the U.S. government, right? And we can highlight the profound deficiency in the enforcement of laws and trigger political and legal transformation around the nation. And so this mechanism is important because of the precedent it can set for all animals, not just the dogs at Ridglan Farms. But to set this precedent, we have to win the petition. So how do we win? Well, the law, including a petition to appoint a special prosecutor, is a lot like a jigsaw puzzle. You got to fit your facts into the puzzle and find the right contours of your facts to fit into the space that's provided for you under the law. And the pieces we need to fit in a special prosecutor petition in Wisconsin are basically threefold. One is we have to make a showing of what's called probable cause. The second is we have to make a showing the prosecutor in the county at issue has declined to prosecute the case despite a finding of probable cause. And third is we have to convince the judge to exercise her discretion. In this case, it's her, Judge Rhonda Lanford. So let me talk about these three pieces and how we plan on July 10th to show probable cause, show prosecutors decline to prosecute, and convince a judge to exercise her discretion. So the first piece is probable cause. What is probable cause? Probable cause is just evidence that would justify a reasonable belief that a crime has been committed. It's a very low bar. So in fact, it's one of the lowest bars in the American legal system. You may have heard the term beyond a reasonable doubt. That's at the other end. That is the standard that's used when you can't have any doubt at all, or you can't have anything more than a reasonable. You can't have a reasonable doubt. That's a high standard. A little below that is clear and convincing evidence, which means, you're not 100% sure, but the evidence is very clear, and maybe it's 75, 25, 80, 20. A step below that is something called preponderance of the evidence, which is like 51%. Most of the evidence, a preponderance of the evidence suggests a crime has been committed. Probable cause is a much lower standard. It is just some evidence that would justify a reasonable belief. It can't be an unreasonable belief. So it can't be, unicorn told me Ridglan committed a crime. There has to be some reasonable evidence. But if we can show some reasonable evidence, we've met the burden of probable cause. And how do we show some reasonable evidence? Well, we have to look at the elements of each of the crimes we believe have been committed and show evidence in each of those elements that a crime has in fact been committed. So what are the elements of the crimes that we believe have been committed? The first is animal cruelty under Chapter 951.02, right? And I said this earlier, but under Chapter 951.02, it is unlawful, it is animal cruelty, to treat an animal in a cruel manner, where cruel means causing unnecessary and excessive pain or suffering or unjustifiable risk of injury or death. The other element, beyond showing the animal's been treated in a cruel manner, is we have to show the defendant, a company in this case, acted with intent or negligence, and we have to show that the practice at issue is not a normal and accepted veterinary practice. Right, so there's kind of three basic pieces. Animal treated in a cruel manner, intent or negligence on the part of the person treating them in a cruel manner, and the practice or action they're taking is not a normal and accepted veterinary practice. There's one other bonus element, which is that if the animal is, as a result of the cruelty, is left mutilated or dead, then the animal cruelty escalates to a felony level. So that's the first offense. The first charge that we have to prove, or we have to provide evidence of probable cause on. The second charge is 951.14, which is failure to provide proper shelter, right? And in this case, the elements are the failure to provide proper shelter, including ventilation, freedom of movement, the things we talked about earlier. And second, we have to show the defendant acted with intent or negligence. Okay, so what is our evidence that 951.02 and 951.14 have been violated? Well, it comes in roughly three categories. And it comes from many different sources, not just animal advocates, but inspection records from state and federal inspectors, documents from companies doing business with Ridglan Farms, even former employees of Ridglan Farms who will, for the first time in history, be testifying in court. They'll be openly testifying in court, whistleblowers, about the things they saw at Ridglan Farms. But there are three rough categories of evidence that these witnesses will be providing on July 10th. The first is flooring and foot injuries. So every single one of the animals at Ridglan Farms lives their entire life, in some cases 6 or 7 years. And two of the three dogs we rescued from Ridglan Farms in April 2017 had lived at Ridglan Farms for 6 years on metal wire every single day of their lives. Right, and this is a problem for a number of reasons. First, when you're standing on wire your entire life, occasionally the wire has holes in it, and dogs' feet literally just get trapped in the wire. When you have 3,000, 4,000 dogs, and they're all living on wire, and you're not maintaining the cages, occasionally a dog's just going to have their foot trapped in the wire. Second, standing on wire every single day of your life, especially when there's feces everywhere, all around you, in a tiny metal cage. And when you're living in a 2 foot by 4 foot metal cage, and I'll say more about the confinement conditions in a moment, and there's feces everywhere, and you're stepping on this wire that's digging into your paws, you're going to get foot infections and foot injuries. And that happens all the time, right? And in fact, this is exactly what state inspectors started to find in October 2016, showing dogs with their feet literally hanging through the wire, which is a violation of law because this is causing unnecessary and excessive pain or suffering for a dog to have their feet trapped in wire. It also notes that small portions of the wire flooring were found to have their coating removed. Right? So there's supposedly a polyurethane coating on the wire to prevent the dogs rubbing up against rusted metal that could cause lesions and injuries. And they found that the coating had been removed and the facility was falling apart, right? And I should just note, it is particularly bad to be living on wire every day of your life when your foot is already injured, when your foot is infected, inflamed, and swollen, and you still have to stand. I mean, if you ever stood on like hard rocks are not as hard as metal wire. A rock is softer than wire. But if you ever stood on hard rocks, imagine standing on hard rocks your entire life. Now imagine standing on rocks your entire life when your feet are inflamed and infected. This is exactly what was found in October 2016. But we have further evidence that was obtained by yours truly. When we walked into Ridglan Farms in April of 2017, I shot with a camera video of a dog on rusted wire. And I'm just going to watch this video right now and show you. We shot video of dogs walking on this rusted wire. And you can see here the wire flooring and how big the holes are, how small the dog's feet are. And you can also see how gingerly this dog is walking. And this is something we noticed immediately when we walked into the facility. We saw that many of the dogs were walking around very gingerly. And we looked at their feet. We saw that their feet were pink and inflamed and swollen, right? I'm just going to watch another video just to show why there are so many infections. And this, again, shows the flooring on the wire and the amount of feces. Each of these dogs is living in a 2 foot by 4 foot space, a very small amount of space, just about twice the length of the average dog, a little more than twice the length of the average dog. And they're pooping and peeing on this wire flooring every single day of their lives. And when they get a little abrasion or cut, dogs, just like all animals, don't like living in their own feces. They don't like stepping in their own feces. They certainly don't like smearing feces into their injuries, into their wounds. And that was happening everywhere. And all 3 of the dogs we rescued from Ridglan Farms, there's video footage of these dogs after we rescued them, struggling to even walk. And this is one of them, Julie. Right? Julie, when she got out, she would walk around just crouched on the ground, barely able to brace herself on the floor, partly because her feet were red and inflamed. And we took video footage as well of just kind of the treatment we're giving the dogs. We were wiping their feet with antibiotics because we were afraid that they weren't able to walk. And you can see in this particular video clip, like especially when I spread kind of the paws open, and I believe this is actually Anna, not Julie. But all 3 of the dogs have the same inflamed feet, diagnosed by a veterinarian. You can see how inflamed her feet are, and especially when I spread the paw pads apart in just a moment. You can see that many of the dogs actually had lesions and bleeding from the inside of their feet. Their feet were so infected. So you see an inspector document this in 2016. We see this in 2017. We report this to the authorities in 2017. You might think, okay, the problem's going to be solved, right? Well, from the things I've already told you, absolutely not. The problem will not be solved. And there's another inspection report from July of 2020 showing the same wire holings and the same wire cage floors. In this case, the inspector even notes that approximately 30% of the enclosures had some degree of rust or wire coating that had worn off. Right? So that exact problem of abrasions and nooks and crannies and dents on the wire cutting into the animal's feet and causing these infections because they're standing on feces. If anything, it's gotten even worse. 30% of the enclosures. And this is all happening after we've reported this to the authorities, after the state inspectors have said this is a problem to the point that puppies' feet are getting injured and their feet are getting caught in the wire. And even after the government prosecuted us in 2021, they brought charges against us in 2021, and there was an enormous amount of attention on Ridglan, right? This company still has the audacity to continue to raise animals in a fashion that leads them to have foot injuries. Because in December of 2023, just a few months before we were slated to go to trial, the USDA, in this case a federal inspector, found again that there were 11 enclosures where the feet or legs of dogs were caught in passing through the mesh floors when they walk. 11 enclosures. So this is what I was talking about earlier when I said the accountability is basically meaningless. The government is asleep at the wheel. And this is why we needed to go into Ridglan Farms ourselves and help these dogs. So that's category 1, the foot injuries. Category 2 is improper shelter. And in that same October 2016 inspection report, and let me just point out while these inspections are supposedly unannounced, they only occur once a year usually, and in many cases, the state and federal government have declined to even show up. They just say, oh, we can do a virtual inspection, or just send us a couple documents, or draft a little statement that your facility is fine. We don't even have to come by. And even when they are announced, these inspectors don't have any search authority or any rating authority. It allows them to enter the facility if they don't have keys, right? So technically they're unannounced, but the inspectors can't even get in the facilities unless the company allows them to. So it's shocking that you find anything at all in these reports. And typically you don't find anything because the inspectors are overwhelmed, they're busy. They're often, again, part of the revolving door between industry and the government. So they know if they write up one of their, the companies they're inspecting, they're not going to get a job later. That's probably a much higher paid job than they had in the government. So it's very rare that you see anything at all in these inspection reports. But in that same October 2016 inspection report, where we saw dogs' feet hanging through the wire, the government inspector also noted that the animals were unlawfully displaying stereotypical behaviors. What is a stereotypical behavior? Stereotypical behavior is a scientific euphemism for an animal exhibiting psychotic repetitive behavior. It's things like circling endlessly, bobbing your head up and down constantly, wall bouncing back and forth. These are things that no healthy human being or animal will do, yet they were finding multiple animals displaying stereotypical behavior. And that report indicates that efforts should be made to address dogs' abnormal stereotypical behaviors. And what happens is when you're living in a 2 foot by 4 foot cage by yourself your entire life, and you're a highly social animal. I mean, dogs are canine familiaris. They're familiar to human beings. They want to be close to human beings especially, but even if not human beings, they want to be near some other animal because they are a pack animal. They cannot survive socially, emotionally, psychologically without stimulation from other living beings. When you force one of these animals to live 6 or 7 years in a cage, they go absolutely insane. And that's what the inspector found in 2016, stereotypical abnormal behavior. And it's very important to point out that term, abnormal behavior, because you remember the law, 951.14, about proper shelter? And do you remember the language of that law that said you can prove improper shelter and the lack of freedom of movement if you can show evidence of debility, and this is a direct quote, debility, stress, or abnormal behavior. So in other words, the state inspector in October 2016 found the exact thing and used the exact language that's unlawful under 951.14 of the Wisconsin Animal Cruelty Laws, right? So that's happened in October 2016. And the inspector notes it and says, hey, you should probably do something about all these dogs that are going psychotic. They're bouncing on walls, they're spinning. It seems like there's a problem. They're not getting enough space and stimulation. And guess what happens about 6 months later when in April 2017, we walk into Ridglan Farms? We find exactly the same thing, except at probably even higher scale. And I'll just show you a couple of clips. This clip is of Julie. This is Julie. And Julie was on the bottom row in a 2 foot by 4 foot metal cage, standing on wire her entire life. She lived there for about a year. In over a 2 hour time period, every single time we looked towards Julie, she was spinning exactly like this for 2 hours. Not 2 seconds, not 2 minutes, not even 20 minutes, 2 hours, constantly spinning. And one of the saddest things was, one of the ways we knew she was spinning from stress and from lack of social stimulation, from a desperate desire to escape, is when we come close, she'd spin a little slower. And then when we moved further away, she would get scared and nervous. And it was like she was begging us to do something. And she'd spin faster. And you can even see it on the camera footage. But Julie was just one of many dogs that we saw spinning and exhibiting abnormal behaviors. We saw dogs like this dog also spinning in a top cage and bouncing on the walls. We saw dogs engage in head bobbing behavior, where they're just bobbing their heads up and down because they have nothing to do all day. And it's important to note, it's not just dogs, but pretty much all domesticated animals, including domesticated farm animals, exhibit these sorts of stereotypic psychotic behaviors when they're trapped in cages. In fact, there was one study that was done and cited in Supreme Court briefing around Proposition 12, the California proposition that banned the use of certain types of intensive confinement on mother pigs, egg-laying hens, and veal cows, found that in just 1 hour of observation of, in this case, pigs trapped in cages, they observed 92.6% of the animals exhibiting stereotypic behavior, 92.6% in just 1 hour. So again, 2016, we're seeing this psychotic behavior. In 2017, we're seeing this psychotic behavior. And what do we see in 2020? Well, we've seen similar problems. Except in 2020, in some ways, it's even worse. Because in 2020, they find that confinement is not just causing the animals to be distressed, it's causing the accumulation of feces and urine to the point that it is burning the throats of the inspector who's in the facility. So I'm going to just pull up the report and show you what the inspector says. But the inspector says, just from walking through this facility, and there's a nice image of what's causing this, and I quote here, "The ammonia was bad enough that I experienced nausea, and my throat and nostrils were irritated for several hours after I left the facility." Air quality has to be very, very, very bad for you to experience nausea. It has to be very, very, very bad for it to burn your throat, not when you were in the bad air, but for hours afterwards. This inspector was in this facility probably for a few minutes and experienced pain for hours afterwards. These dogs are living in that facility for years, unable to escape their cage. And the image in this inspection report shows why. Because they have these little catch pans underneath every one of the cages. And when you have thousands of dogs, you gotta have a lot of poop and urine, and it's gonna take a lot of effort to clean all that poop and urine. It's a lot easier to just put a pan underneath each of the cages and catch all the urine and feces and flush it out every now and then. If you don't flush it out enough, when you have 4,000 dogs or hundreds of dogs in a single industrial shed, the ammonia is gonna get so bad, it could potentially be fatal. And that's what happened at Ridglan Farms. And again, that's not proper shelter, because under Wisconsin law, providing proper shelter also includes ventilation. And I quote now, "Facilities shall be adequately ventilated by natural mechanical means to provide for the health of the animals at all times." So Ridglan should have been providing ventilation that protected the health of the animal at all times. Instead, it was such a filthy, dangerous place that when an inspector walked in just for a few minutes, he was nauseated and his throat burned for hours afterwards. This is a violation of law. And then I should finally add that former employees of Ridglan came forward who were at the farm in 2022 and said exactly the same thing. The smell was so awful we couldn't bear it. I saw psychotic animals spinning. I saw animals living on cage wire, covered in feces, every single day of their lives, 365 days out of the year. Okay, so this is all bad enough, but we're finally getting to what's probably the worst thing that has been found in Ridglan Farms, and this is the third category of evidence, and that is surgical mutilation of the dogs. So the first I learned about surgical mutilation came from a report by an accreditation organization called ALAC. ALAC is the Association for Assessment and Accreditation of Laboratory Animal Care, ALAC. And this is an independent or supposedly independent organization that can give a certification to a vivisection or breeding facility to show they're complying with the guide on the care of laboratory animals. And ALAC is mostly seen by all animal advocates as a scam because they're paid for by the industry. It's kind of like a company paying someone to put a gold sticker on their company. And yet even ALAC, we found documents showing that ALAC, which normally is just a rubber stamp, said, hey, you guys are doing this surgery called devocalization surgery where you cut the vocal cords of the animals, which is bad enough. But because ALAC is ALAC and they're kind of a scummy nonprofit that supports animal use, they don't have a problem with cutting the animal's vocal cords. But they did note that the facility was not even sanitizing the equipment between surgeries, which is just a fundamental public health problem, right? The second thing I noted about these devocalization surgeries, though, was another independent organization that normally is just a hack for animal industry, an organization called the American Veterinary Medical Association, which is the largest organization of veterinarians in the United States. And this is, again, an organization that normally is not on the side of animal advocates. For example, when COVID-19 caused all these slaughterhouses and factory farms to shut down, and the factory farmers decided, hey, we don't want to keep feeding these animals because it's too expensive to feed them. We can't slaughter them because all the slaughterhouses shut down. So what they did was they just closed all the vents and pumped hot steam into their facilities and burned all the animals, roasted all the animals alive. That was endorsed by the AVMA. The AVMA said, yeah, that's cool. Go ahead and roast hundreds of thousands of animals alive. That seems like a humane thing to do. So the AVMA is hardly an aggressive animal advocate. And even the AVMA strongly discourages devocalization surgery, right? What they write on their website is that they strongly discourage devocalization because of the surgery's negative impacts on animal welfare. The procedure doesn't affect the primary motivators of the unwanted behavior. It is frequently ineffective in preventing inappropriate or excessive barking, and therefore should not be done because there are significant risks and complications, including pain, associated with the surgery. So even the AVMA doesn't support the surgery. And so I'm thinking, wow, the ALAC, which is a rubber stamp, says they're doing things wrong. The AVMA, which is normally a rubber stamp, says Ridglan is doing things that are strongly discouraged. Let's find out more. And we did a little digging. One of the first things I found was a scientific study that looked like it was from I kid you not, just like a horror movie. Because the first thing I saw when I looked through the study is a series of beagle skulls that had been disfigured and cut open by experimenters, right? And this is an article from the journal Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery. So they're basically forcing these dogs to have facial disfigurement so they can perform plastic surgery on them. And there's an image of a series of skulls, first an x-ray, and then actually just physical images of the skulls with various forms of disfigurement, because they've just basically taken a saw and cut open these dogs. And they actually watch how these dogs are covered after disfiguring them and perform plastic surgery on them after cutting their facial bones and their facial structures open. So this is the first clue I got that there's weird, creepy surgical stuff happening to the dogs at Ridglan Farms, and it's all being reported openly in a scientific study. And then we heard from people on the inside. And we had not just one, but two separate whistleblowers come forward and say, not only are dogs being devocalized, not only are they being held down and having their vocal cords cut open, and literally what the employee told us is they literally cut out a piece of the vocal cords and just throw it on the ground and throw the dog zombie-like back into the cage because the dog is like paralyzed in an enormous amount of pain. But they found that these surgeries are being performed by people who are not veterinarians, by random staff members who have no veterinary training. And for the record, the American College of Veterinary Surgery condemns the practice of non-veterinarians performing surgery. Their website says that all surgical procedures have inherent risks that can lead to serious complications and even patient death if not performed by trained, qualified personnel. And you and I would probably agree with that. If I were to have surgery, I probably wouldn't just call some random person on the street to cut me open and take out my organs or rip open my vocal cords. I probably wouldn't do that anyways. But if I were, for some reason, to decide I wanted my vocal cords ripped open, I'd probably call a surgeon, not a random person off the street. And in Ridglan Farms, they were just using random non-vets. That is a violation of the veterinary practice and licensing law in the state of Wisconsin, around the country, and it is cruel. It is causing excessive and unnecessary pain and suffering. It is a mutilation, in fact, that leads to felony charge being justified under the Wisconsin Animal Cruelty Law. But what's worst of all is what happens afterwards. And I saw this myself, and I could show you video footage right now of one of the many dogs we found in Ridglan Farms who had been devocalized. And one thing to note about this particular dog is when a dog can't get attention and can't bark, she'll often develop other psychotic behavior. And you can see the lesion on the side of this dog's face and the fact that the dog keeps scratching the side of the cage. And the lesion is very likely because her devocalization had caused her to be stressed. She cannot manifest her stress in a normal way because she's been debarked. Her vocal cords have been cut. So she's been rubbing her face to the point that there's a bloody lesion on the side of her face. You would think that's bad enough. But the other thing we learned from two independent whistleblowers, and we actually now have access, or should have access soon, to standard operating procedures, actual manuals of the company for how to torture and mutilate these animals without a veterinarian, without painkillers, is a procedure called cherry eye surgery. So cherry eye is a condition where the gland of the nictitating membrane, I might not be pronouncing it correctly, I apologize for those of you who know what a nictitating membrane is. The gland of the nictitating membrane, which is basically a tear-producing gland in the eye, for some reason comes out of the eyelid and is protruding outwards and sometimes gets infected and inflamed. This is a very dangerous condition and needs to be treated. In fact, every veterinary manual, every veterinarian we've talked to says, not only do you need a surgeon, you probably need an ophthalmological surgeon because the eye is a highly vascularized, sensitive portion of the body. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want someone digging into my eye with a knife and cutting something out of my eye because there's an infection, right? And what we found is that every single day at Ridglan, or almost every single day, there were non-veterinarians pinning dogs to the ground, taking a pair of scissors, pulling this gland out when they saw it inflamed, and just cutting it off. No blood control, no hemostasis, no painkillers, general anesthesia or local anesthesia, and no post-operative recovery period. They just throw the dog back in the cage. The employee who went through this practice described it as a bloodbath. Blood was streaming out of the dog's eye, all over their clothes, all over their body, all over their hands, left a 1 square foot pool of blood on the ground. And after the procedure was done, the dog was just thrown back into a cage. Right? This is not just animal cruelty. This is a mutilation. If you recall, under 951.02, if you engage in cruel treatment of a dog, that is not a normal and accepted veterinary practice. And again, mutilating a dog by a non-surgeon, a non-veterinarian, is against all the protocols of the American veterinary industry. If you treat a dog with cruelty and it leads to a dog being mutilated, and certainly a dog with a disfigurement in their eye, unable to produce tears because their cherry eye gland has been removed unnecessarily, has been mutilated, that is a felony. Not just a misdemeanor, it is a felony. But in many ways, that isn't even the worst mutilation that we have evidence of from Ridglan Farms, because the last thing that our witnesses will testify about on July 10th, which you see not just at Ridglan Farms, but in pretty much any context where animals, including human beings, are intensively confined, like prisons, is the animals will often fight. In one case, an employee who is used to seeing animals fight, used to having thousands of animals, none of whom can be properly supervised. And in some cases, the animals will be thrown in cages, usually the younger animals. So they're usually put into a solitary cage or 2 per cage later in life. But early in life, to socialize the animals, they put them in pens of like 8, 9, 10 animals. The dogs would fight each other, and when a weak or vulnerable dog collapsed, all the dogs, because they're psychotic from being confined in a cage, would set on that dog. And in one case, an employee testified, they found a dog who was so ripped to pieces that half the dog was missing, and he believed that the other half had been eaten by the other dogs. This is excessive and unnecessary pain and suffering. This is a mutilation. It is a felony in the state of Wisconsin, and it is time for the state of Wisconsin to enforce the law and prevent things like this from happening to the Ridglan dogs. So I hope I've satisfied to you that we've established probable cause for violations of 951.02 and 951.14. We've shown that there's evidence that would justify a reasonable belief that a crime has been committed. Let's move to piece 2 of the jigsaw puzzle, which is the prosecutor has to have declined to prosecute. Let me remind you, the main interaction I recently had with the prosecutor was the bizarre experience of being told that I had threatened a company with death threats, and therefore they were not going to charge me with a crime. Again, just bizarre on so many levels. But beyond that, animal activists sent animal cruelty reports, and not just animal activists, but a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist in 2018 wrote a report called Bred to Suffer. And we provided this report. We provided opinions from veterinary experts, even former federal prosecutors like Bonnie Clapper, are very well known. In fact, a famous federal prosecutors busted drug kingpins across the country and world. Collecting all this evidence and saying to the DA of Dane County, Wisconsin, Ismail Zahn, hey, you got an obligation to enforce the law. You got to protect the most vulnerable people in this community, and that's the dogs. And in fact, Ismail Zahn has said repeatedly, I'm here to protect the vulnerable. He's a progressive. He wants to protect the vulnerable. That includes dogs. And right up until April of 2023, when we filed this petition, guess what response we got every single time? We, other activists, law firms, law clerks, former prosecutors, veterinarians, reported animal cruelty. Our response was absolutely nothing. Silence. Until we appeared in court. And for the first time in the history of this case, the DA of Dane County, Wisconsin, Ismail Zahn, showed up to a hearing where there was going to be some evidence of animal cruelty. But guess what? He didn't show up on our side. Even though he's a prosecutor, he's supposed to be protecting the public against violations of law, he showed up on Ridglan's side. He was sitting right next to Ridglan's attorney. They were buddy-buddy. It was just the two of them. It was kind of actually a little pathetic because all the animal activists were on one side and we were so crowded we literally couldn't even fit, like spilling over into the other side. But no one wanted to sit on Ridglan's side. So I think there were a few people who like eventually stomached it and said, okay, we'll sit on Ridglan's side. But Ismail Azzam is like sitting by himself right next to Ridglan's attorney. And after the judge had the initial hearing and said, okay, you guys are presenting what's called a prima facie case, just to, facially, it seems like you have some evidence of a criminal violation. I went up to Ismail Azzam and I said very respectfully and very politely, we've been trying to reach you for many years, since 2018. I would love to have a conversation with you. And guess what he says? He just says no and turns around and walks away. But interestingly, when I had this interaction with him, there's a journalist right next to us, and immediately this journalist starts scribbling on a pad about what he had just seen because he had observed that interaction. And Ismail looks at this journalist scribbling on his pad, looks at me and says, fine, I'll talk to you. Meet me up in the office in 10 minutes. So we go up in the office. I do a short version of what I just shared with you, all this overwhelming evidence of just some of the most horrific, nightmarish abuse. I mean, literally, animals being ripped to pieces by surgical procedures without painkillers. Ismail Azzam does not have any emotional reaction at all. He just stares and looks at me with kind of a mean glare. Doesn't say a word and says, you'll hear from us at the hearing. And that's it. And so, interestingly, we do have a little bit of a dilemma in that even though we've tried for so many years, for 5 years now, to get the DA of Wisconsin, of Dane County, Wisconsin, even to respond to our entreaties, and they have never responded. We've never got them to officially and publicly say, we decline to prosecute. But the good thing is we have an enormous amount of case law on this type of petition showing that if a DA just refuses to prosecute over an extended period of time, that is sufficient to show that a prosecutor has, in fact, declined to prosecute. So we think we're strong on this ground. And we're going to present that evidence, and I'll testify on July 10th about my experiences trying to get Dane County, Wisconsin, to even pay attention to this issue. Okay, so that's piece 2. And then finally we come to piece 3, which is we have to convince the judge to exercise her discretion and appoint a special prosecutor. Because the judge, even if there's probable cause, even if the prosecutor has declined to prosecute, that does not necessarily require the judge to appoint a special prosecutor. It just gives them the discretion. And honestly, there isn't a lot of case law or authority to help us understand how the judge should exercise her discretion. So what we've done is just tried to show her the entire community of upstanding citizens in Dane County, Wisconsin, wants these laws to be enforced and these dogs to be protected. And this includes the Dane County Humane Society, which wrote a letter to the judge indicating that if DCHS, if their own humane society, was keeping dogs in deplorable conditions and disfiguring them through amateur surgeries, there would be public outcry and an investigation. Why should it be any different with Ridglan Farms? Indeed. It includes the Wisconsin Federated Humane Societies, not just the Dane County Humane Society, but all the Federated Humane Societies. And it includes multiple vets in the state of Wisconsin. In fact, every vet we've talked to has said these things that we're seeing, this mistreatment of dogs, is not just cruel, it is nightmarishly vile and evil and unacceptable and far beyond the pale for any veterinary standard. And finally, most recently, we've gotten some of the most renowned animal behavior and dog behavior experts, people like Mark Beckhoff and Patricia McConnell, to write declarations and expert opinions saying that just as a matter of policy, in common sense, this abuse needs to stop. The dogs need to be taken out of the cages. They need to be given to families where they get love and freedom and see the sunlight for the first time. And we have to start enforcing the law. And that's what this case is about. Whether for the first time in Dane County history, the legal system will finally enforce the law, even to protect the most vulnerable and powerless beings in the county. Okay, so a final thought. I said at the beginning, this case is not just about Ridglan Farms, it's about the tens of thousands of other dogs across the country and the billions of animals trapped in factory farms and laboratories and other facilities in situations of confinement and torture. The most obvious way this case goes beyond Ridglan Farms is that there is only one remaining large beagle production company in the nation, really the world, if Ridglan Farms shuts down. That is Marshall Bioresources in upstate New York. And if there's only one supplier of beagles left for the use of dogs in experiments, that is not a sufficiently robust supply chain. If you've only got one supplier and that supplier, for whatever reason, one day or 1 week is they're having a logistical problem. The people who experiment on dogs are just going to stop experimenting on dogs because they know there's only one supplier left. We don't have enough confidence that we're going to get the dogs we need, and they'll just stop doing the experiments. But more importantly, the precedent we set politically and culturally and morally and even legally in this case, if we prevail, is a precedent that can be adopted across the country and world. In the UK, Animal Equality just did an incredibly impressive report showing that animal cruelty violations are virtually unenforced, especially when it comes to factory farms. In the state of California, we've pointed out that over the last 9 years since Proposition 2 went into effect, widely praised as the most important animal welfare legislation in the world's history, there has yet to be a single successful prosecution under this law, despite the fact that there are tens of millions of hens and pigs and cows who've gone through torture and caging and slaughter in horrific ways in violation of that law. There's yet to be a single successful enforcement action. When you see over and over again, and even when the most distinguished scholars in the world, including one of my former mentors, a Harvard Law School professor named Cass Sunstein, are pointing out that enforcement of laws to protect the most vulnerable beings is non-existent, ordinary citizens need to take direct action. And normally, when we take direct action, all we can do is just with our own hands and feet and bodies, walk into a facility where animals are being tortured the way we walked in Ridglan Farms and take a couple of the animals out to receive veterinary care. But through mechanisms like the Special Prosecutor petition, suddenly the animal advocacy movement has the full power of the US government. Because while the Special Prosecutor is not a government lawyer before they are appointed, once they're appointed, they have all the tools and resources available to a prosecutor for the state of Wisconsin or the US federal government. And once it happens, we have an even playing field, or a much more even playing field. Instead of fighting against a multi-billion-dollar industry with chump change, with very limited resources, without the ability to execute search warrants or pursue a real criminal investigation, we can do all those things. And we can do all those things not just for dogs in Dane County, Wisconsin, but for chickens at factory farms in California, for cats who are tortured in vivisection facilities in upstate New York, for cows being tortured in Vermont. Whatever the situation is, we need to find these mechanisms, harnessing the structures already in the legal system to massively amplify our power to create change. And if we win on July 10th, that is exactly what is going to happen. So I'm very interested in your thoughts on all this, what you think of this strategy. And obviously stay tuned, because on July 10th, we'll get at least an initial result. Although it's actually possible the judge doesn't issue a decision. In fact, maybe likely the judge doesn't issue a decision immediately on July 10th. We'll get a sense of what happens. Regardless of what happens on July 10th, we need people exploring these possibilities, going through evidence of animal abuse, recognizing that laws are being violated, and finding novel ways to harness the tools of the government, which normally is against us and normally is literally trying to put us in prison for merely trying to give aid to these animals, and turn the tables on the industry by using the tools of the government against these abusive industries. And we want you to be a part of it. So stay tuned for more on July 10th, and make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can see more content on this page. We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.